Right, hi everybody. Welcome to the live stream here from St Edmunds Arrowsmith in Knowsley. I know we've got a lot of students from all around the place joining us. We've got some students from Unity Academy in Blackpool. We've got the Amity International School in Abu Dhabi who is joining us as well. We've got a school from Sheffield. We've got Ormiston Academy. Welcome to everybody from Ormiston. And we've got lots of other schools joining us live around the UK and the world by the looks of it. Delighted today to be joined by Paul Reed, who's a military historian on World War I and a battlefield expert, who's going to be talking to us today about medicine on the Western Front and particularly, I guess, medical conditions and the way in which soldiers were treated for those conditions in World War I. I'm joined by my entire, we can't see them, but we've got an entire Year 11 group, my Year 11 group here. Say hello, Year 11. Say hi. Hi. Yeah? I'll let them say hi. It doesn't matter. There they are. Just to prove they're here. Just to prove they're here. But I'm joined by Year 11, who are going to be just on the microphone.
You've gone silent there, Tom. Can't hear you.
There we go. I'm back. Okay. Hopefully they will be asking questions as we go through. And yeah, over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, Tom. It's great to be here. Medicine on the Western Front is a vast subject, and we can't possibly do justice to it in an hour today. But we're going to look at some key aspects of it connected to the British soldiers' experience of the First World War. And as with all these sort of online meetings, we've already hit a bit of a technological snag. And so I'm just going to move on to the next one now, and hopefully you can see that. So this slide shows a couple of images of men of the good, excellent, of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Now, this is the main unit connected with medical treatment throughout the First World War in every theatre of war. And it grew out of the Army Medical Services from the previous century, when in many campaigns that the British fought right across the globe, more men died of disease than in combat. So the Army underwent a massive period of refurbishment and reorganisation, and the medical services were disbanded. And in 1898, the Royal Army Medical Corps was formed, and their first war was the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which had a profound effects on the whole of the British Army, really, leading up to the First World War in 1914. And the Medical Corps learned a lot of lessons, really, in that campaign, particularly in the treatment of wounded and also the treatment of disease, some of which would later be applied to the First World War. And, of course, this also coincides with the general advancement in medicine as part of this period, which I wouldn't claim to be an expert on. But in 1914, to give you some idea of how important the Royal Army Medical Corps was, in 1914, the man on the left in a typical sort of barracks photograph, that's something that he's had taken in a studio that has been sent home to his family. It's got the badge of the Royal Army Medical Corps on there. There were 9,000 men like him in the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1914. So that's out of about 275,000 that served abroad in France and Flanders during that year with the original British Expeditionary Force. So it's not an insignificant number, but to give you some idea of how important their role was as the war went on, if we look at the guys on the right, and that photograph is taken on the Somme, you can see they're a lot less smart, they're a lot more grubby. The trousers that they've got on are trench waders as opposed to normal trousers, because they're wading through the muddy conditions, in this case of the Somme. This is taken on the Somme in 1916. They've got a little bag around their shoulders that doesn't contain their personal items in. It's got a gas mask in there. So this is, a year or more into the use of poison gas on the battlefields. They've got a bit of respite with a puppy on their lap there. Some of you may just about see him sitting there. But to give you some idea, that Royal Army Medical Corps, the one that would go to the end of the war, by 1918, there were 13,000 officers and 154,000 men. So it went from 9,000 in 1914 to almost 170,000 in 1918, which reflected the growing size of the army and the importance of the medics. And men like these, their job was to work on or behind the battlefields to treat the wounded. Now, the ones who actually pick the wounded up in the first place are these guys. So these men are stretcher bearers. Now, often when we use that phrase, stretcher bearer, we think of the Royal Army Medical Corps, and there were men that carried stretchers in the RAMC, but the stretcher bearers were infantry soldiers like these. So these are two men of the Middlesex Regiment on the Somme, and they've got a white armband with SB on it for stretcher bearer, and it was to distinguish them as opposed to being men of a rifle platoon, because they went into action not with rifles, not with weapons, but with stretchers and medical equipment. Now, they weren't quite the same as Royal Army Medical Corps men. In the RAMC, and a lot of men did this in the war, you could be a conscientious objector who you didn't think it was right to kill other people, but you wanted to do something to support the war effort, so you joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. That wasn't uncommon. But in the infantry, as a stretcher bearer, you could be part of a stretcher bearer section, but return to your rifle section, your rifle platoon at any time. But these men were the first port of call. So their job was to go out onto the battlefields while the fighting was going on, in the midst of shot and shell and shell holes and barbed wire and artillery bombardments and machine guns. And they would run out there at full pelt with their stretchers and their equipment to pick up the wounded. So their job was...
Did they have weapons, Paul? Oh.
No, they didn't carry weapons, because there was the Lee Enfield rifle, which was the standard one of that time, was cumbersome in terms of, if you're carrying a stretcher, which is sort of 7 or 8 foot long, then that plus your medical equipment plus a rifle isn't really a good proposition. So these men went into battle completely unarmed, and their job was not to fight.
Was that a job that was that a job they wanted to do, or was that, I mean, it was presumably that was something people didn't want to do. Was it?
Well, you got more pay for it, because it was a specialist part of a unit, so you got an increased level of pay. Before the war, many of these men would have been part of the battalion band, so they would have been musicians with drums or trumpets or whatever bit of musical equipment that they had. But as the war went on, that the connection between being part of the battalion band and a stretcher bearer was not always a continuous one. What they looked for were men of good intelligence, good morale, and the ability to think on their feet. So not just a squaddy in the ranks who fix bayonets and charge at the enemy. They wanted somebody a little sort of up the pegging scale from that in terms of ability and intelligence. And these men, their job was to go out, like I say, amidst shot and shell and pick up the wounded. Now that brings us on, before we pause on for a second, onto this guy who, for your group is of particular interest. This is Noel Chasse, who was the only medical officer during the war to get the Victoria Cross and Bar, one of 2 medical officers to achieve that distinction. The first one, a chap called Martin Leake, got one in the Boer War and his bar at the First Battle of Ypres in 1914, and one of only 3 men in the history of the Victoria Cross to receive the award twice. The third one was a New Zealander called Upham, who got it in the Second World War. Noel Chasse was the son of the Bishop of Liverpool. He was one of a pair of twins. There was also twin girls. And when I was probably about the same age as your group, I met Chavasse's twin sisters at the Imperial War Museum. They came to give some of their family treasures to the museum's collection. So it was quite an incredible family with 2 twin boys, 2 twin girls, and some other brothers as well. And sadly, several brothers did not survive the war. But Noel Chasse was a medical student, and he is typical of a lot of medical officers who were doctors during the war, in that he was not a full-time soldier. So he carried on his studies, could be a practicing doctor wherever he lived, in his case, Liverpool. But he had joined the Territorial Force, as it was called then, which was the Territorial Army. So he was a part-time soldier in the 10th King's Liverpool Regiment, which were called the Liverpool Scottish. And this was a group of men that were recruited in Liverpool who had Scottish ancestry or were Scottish. That was originally. And on the right there is a photograph that I have in my archives, which is his stretcher bearers. So those are Noel Chasse's stretcher bearers, all recruited from Liverpool, all came from Liverpool. And it's taken in 1915 when he begun his work as a medical officer. The picture's almost certainly taken by Noel Chasse. And at that time, he'd already been decorated with the Military Cross for going out into the midst of battle and tending the wounded under fire. He'd then get his first Victoria Cross on the Somme. And when you read the accounts of it, there he is. He's a single man on this vast open landscape of the Somme, charging out to pick up the wounded. And at one stage, he's something like 20 feet away from where the Germans are. And it's just incredible to think that there he was operating this close. Now, he wore an armband. As you can see, the men in the picture they've got their stretcher bearers one. He wore one with a red cross on, which made clear that he was a medical officer. Now, in the confusion of battle, not every soldier could see that. So there were sadly some cases of medics being killed, but he survived and he recovered many soldiers during that battle. And then jumping on a year in 1917, during the opening of the Third Battle of Ypres, which we'd commonly called Passchendaele, he went out again to pick up the wounded. And in that battle, now, if your group has studied this, they'll know that the conditions on the battlefield were atrocious at Passchendaele, with heavy rain and mud and men just disappearing into the landscape. And it had already begun to become like that when he was operating in the first few days of the battle. And he knew that there were wounded soldiers in shell holes that were rapidly filling up of water. And if he didn't recover them, they would drown. So he went out again and in doing so, in recovering these guys, he was very seriously injured by a shell blast and died a few days later in a dressing station behind the lines. So his award of a bar to the Victoria Cross was a posthumous one. And he's the only man in the care of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to have VC and bar on his grave. So he's a sort of a local connection to you and your group. So
yeah,
I don't know. I'll pause there for a minute.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Paul, I think these guys will know Chasse Park, which is in the centre of Liverpool, which is obviously named after Noel Chasse. So if you ever go to Noel Chasse Park in the city centre, it's named after him, Noel Chasse. Yeah, who got the VC. Why was he British? Was he British? Yeah, he was from Liverpool.
Oh, it's the Spanish Armada all over again.
Yeah, he was from Liverpool. Yeah, Chasse. Sorry, Paul, you're not allowed to lie. That was a good question. Yeah, but he was from Liverpool. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, well, you've got if you go to Liverpool, Holly, city centre, you've got Chasse Park, which is named after this guy on screen now, who got the Victoria Cross for, as Paul said, going out into no man's land and essentially rescuing injured soldiers, taking them back, and eventually he actually got killed. And I think, Paul, he got killed from, wasn't it a shell hit his dugout? Was it that he got killed in the end? Was that...
Well, there is some dispute as to exactly what killed him in the end, but it was a shell blast, and he was brought into a dressing station, a casualty clearing station behind the lines at Ypres, and he passed under the nose of the commander of that, who was Martin Leake, the other VC and bar. So there was this incredible connection that they knew each other. And as he was brought in, sadly dying, there was Martin Leake on duty at that casualty clearing station on that day. So it's there's a strange connection between the two of them there. But yeah, sadly, that's what killed him.
Yeah, and in terms of the Germans firing at these guys with the armbands on, did that make them more of a target or less of a target?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there was one battalion at Ypres who in a year had 3 medical officers killed. Who were killed out on the battlefield tending to the wounded, and one of them thought he was safe because he was wearing his armband with a red cross on, stood bolt upright, having just treated a man for some serious wounds, when he was shot instantly by a German sniper. Now, this is not the Germans necessarily behaving badly, because on a battlefield, an armband that's only a few inches by a few inches may not be visible. But nevertheless, that it meant that there they were in the middle of this, very vulnerable, and the number of medical officers killed in the war was astonishingly high.
Yeah, because I would have suspected it would have actually presented a target for the Germans on the battlefield, in that sense. We've got a question here from Step by Step on YouTube, and it says, "What did you have to do to get the VC? So to get a Victoria Cross, what was the threshold? What was the point where you would qualify for getting that medal?"
That's a very good question, and the heart of it is that your life had to be on the line. There had to be an imminent risk of death in what you were doing. So in the act of bravery that would result in this award, there had to be the strong possibility of you being killed. So many of these awards were posthumous. They were awarded because the man did indeed die. Now, what this meant is that the Victoria Cross was the only posthumous award in the whole war. You couldn't get any other medal posthumously, only the Victoria Cross. And what that meant was that many men who carried out incredible acts of bravery were not awarded anything at all because there were not sufficient witnesses. Because the other criteria for getting the award is there had to be a certain number of officers who witnessed it, because officers were gentlemen, their word was their bond, and only they could be the ones that decided who did and who did not get the award. Now, 100 and something years later, that's very different in the army now, but then that's how they operated. So it meant that many men went with nothing. And one of the First World War veterans that I interviewed back in the 1980s, this is one of his favorite sayings. He used to say that in the war, there were two types of crosses, the Victoria Cross and the wooden cross. And most got the latter. And what he meant by that is most men got a wooden cross. They were killed. They got nothing for their bravery except a grave on a battlefield. Yeah.
Difficult job though. Wouldn't want that job with no weapon. Yeah.
No. And when you read the accounts, many men during the war were recommended for Victoria Crosses, but never got them. But
just a reminder. Just a reminder before you move on, Paul, I know we've got a number of different schools watching this kind of around the world. If you want to ask a question to Paul, literally all you need to do is write the question in the YouTube chat on the YouTube stream that you're watching it on. You can just write in that chat any questions that your students have. You can type it in there and I will put it up on the screen. So yeah.
Cool. So we'll move on to the next bit now. So having looked at the men that actually recovered the wounded, and we'll come on to the process by which they did that, we'll dip into for a minute to what were some of the key medical advancements that resulted as a consequence of the work that they did. And some of these were things that existed before the war and that were fine-tuned, and others were things that came in during the war itself. And there's three images on there from left to right. We've got an X-ray. Now, X-rays were vitally important. And if you look at this one, you can see there's an object in the middle of the X-ray next to his spine, which is a bullet head. So this is a round from a rifle or machine gun that's entered this soldier's body and has been discovered its exact location by the use of X-ray. And X-rays, they've been developed years before the Great War, but this was the first time that they were used in such large numbers by ordinary medical units with ordinary people, soldiers from all sorts of background. And they were part of the way in which a soldier's life could be saved. Because if we think of the nature of trench warfare, which I know is a big thing that you study, one of the things that killed and wounded men the most was artillery, was shell fire. And when shells explode, they break up into all these fragments. And soldiers can be absolutely peppered with these. And how do you find the tiniest slither of shell fragment in a soldier's body? How? It can cause, even small amounts can cause death. So the only way to get them out and save that soldier's life was to use X-ray to find out where they were in the body. And there must have been many occasions when they X-rayed soldiers like this, and the medical officers must have just gasped at the number of shell fragments that were in these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, Year 11, if you have any questions while we're going through this, then just put your hand up and you can ask the question verbally. You're live right now on audio. So if you want to ask a question verbally, then you can do, like literally live to Paul. Okay, so just put your hand up if you want to.
And I'll do my best to answer it.
And he'll do his best to answer it. Yeah.
So that's X-rays. In the middle there, that little fancy little box with the bottle in it, that's a blood transfusion kit. Now, one of the ways that you can save people's life is through the transfusion of blood, particularly when they've lost a lot of blood. And again, blood transfusion existed before the war. There was a lot of confusion about different blood groups. So they weren't entirely sure as to how this worked, although that got better as the war went on. But the implementation of blood transfusion very close to the battlefield in portable kits like this meant that this again was a life-saving bit of kit that could save thousands, as it did, thousands and thousands of soldiers' lives. Now, on the right, this is something that actually grew out of the war itself, and it's one of the sort of the hardest thing to see, really, I think. And I think, obviously with a group of students, it's something that we approach carefully, and that is the terrible wounds that soldiers suffered in the war and the effects that they had on them, physical effects. So many men lost arms and they lost limbs, and many soldiers' faces were disfigured by bullets or shell fragments or explosions, or in aircraft or inside tanks where there was fire. And as the war went into its final phase in the last couple of years of the war, the use of plastic surgery to rebuild a soldier's face, to give him a life beyond the terrible wound that he'd suffered, was something that was developed by medical officers both in Britain and close to the battlefield as well. One of the veterans that I interviewed, he took a shell fragment that took off almost all of his lower jaw, which they sort of patched up with a bandage, and he ended up by accident in a hospital behind the lines where there was an American plastic surgeon that rebuilt his face, and he spent about 2 years in hospital as a consequence of this. And what we see in this photograph is a China faceplate being placed on this soldier's face. And some men had such terrible wounds, they thought the best way to deal with it, if they couldn't use plastic surgery, was to use a plate made out of China, specially cast around the shape of that soldier's face, and then it would be fitted, and then they would paint it to make it look like real skin and eyebrows and eyelids and everything else. And the men would have to wear them. It would be fixed to their head by a little piece of tape that would go around their ears, and they'd have to wear that. Now, your class can think, did that cover your wound, or did that make you more conspicuous?
Yeah, well, quite, because you'd be able to see it, wouldn't you? I would guess the plate around the person's face, if it was made out of porcelain, then it'd be pretty obvious to see it, I'm guessing. What do we think, folks? Would you take one of those, or would you rather walk around with the wound?
I'd rather one of them.
You'd rather the plate on your face? But you'd walk around with the wound instead of the plate? I think most people are saying here that they'd rather walk around without the plate. Yeah. Most people are saying they'd probably just accept the fact that they've been badly mauled and then get on with it,
Well, that's a really good response. And let me give you a little story to follow that up. Is that in the 1980s, I traced a veteran who had been wounded like this, and he had a China faceplate, and he kept it in a drawer in his house. He didn't wear it then because he was in his nearly 90 years old then, and his face had recovered as much as it was ever going to recover. And there's all these silvery scars on his face where the wound had been, and he'd been hit on the Somme and hung on the German wire in front of their trenches for several days before he'd been found, and was peppered by bullets and shrapnel and everything else. And anyway, he was given one of these China faceplates, and when he died, I spoke to his daughter because they were very rare, and I didn't think the Imperial War Museum had an example of it. So I was trying to get her to give it to the Imperial War Museum, and she said, I'm not being funny, she said, but I lived all my life as a child with the stigma of a father who had to wear one of these faceplates, and I couldn't bear to look at it. As soon as he was dead, I took it out the drawer and I smashed it with a hammer, because of the stigma that it surrounded, her father, their family, and her as a child was just too much, and she couldn't bear to keep it or do anything with it except smash it and destroy it and get rid of it. So, I think your class's reaction to that, it's an interesting one, because did it help the man or did it hinder him? I'm sure that's something we could debate for hours.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a question here. The class was wondering if you could take blood from a dead body into a wounded soldier. So if you could take the blood or not.
I don't believe that that's something that you can do. No, I'm not sure that's even done now. I think there's an ethical issue with that over consent. I wouldn't like to be an expert on that, but no, the practicalities of it is with blood transfusion. It was normally done, as we'll look at in a minute, quite some way from the battlefield, where there were hopefully a large number of volunteers who were physically fit and unwounded who could supply the blood for you by doing one of these transfusions. So that it wasn't a necessity to do that. And in most cases, with soldiers who died, they were placed, if it was in a medical facility, they'd be placed into a morgue prior to, and I use that phrase morgue very, very loosely, prior to being buried in a cemetery, or they'd be buried on the battlefield itself, and nobody would be looking to recover those bodies for blood transfusion. So, no, it wasn't done.
We've got two questions here from students who are watching this in the lecture theatre, Paul, so they're not actually sat in front of me now, they're somewhere else, but you can either answer these now or later on. But the first one is, in Paul's opinion, what was the most important medical development in World War I and why? And question two, were British soldiers reprimanded or punished for shooting German medics? So I don't know whether you want to answer those two now or whether you want to come back to that.
Well, one of them I'll answer with this next picture, and the other one I'll say
okay.
Reprimanded for shooting German medics. Again, the Germans wore a similar sort of armband, and sometimes there are examples of a white circle with a red cross being painted on German Stahlhelm, steel helmets, later on in the war, and so on. But again, there were instances where they just didn't see it. They didn't see it, and medics got killed. And I don't think that there isn't a lot of evidence to say that they were deliberately targeted, because as the war went on, both sides treated each other's wounded. So if you were in an attack and you captured a German trench, you treat their wounded in exactly the same way you treat your own. So it was realized that if you shoot the medics and you get a reputation for shooting the medics, then those medics that you're shooting, their comrades who've survived, are unlikely to treat you if you ended up wounded as a prisoner of war. So it wasn't something that was commonplace, and I don't know of any examples of soldiers being reprimanded for it. In terms of the most important medical advancement in the war, now that's a very interesting question, but one that saved an awful lot of lives is this thing that we're looking at now, which is a Thomas splint. Now, this was designed to keep a leg steady, because when men went into an attack, now your class will know this, when you go over the top, you come up out of a trench, and you're standing up above that trench, and the Germans are on the other side of the battlefield with machine guns firing from their trenches. So the bullets are coming at you just above your ankle and at the level of your knee. So that means if you get hit by their machine gun fire, there's a good chance that it's going to go through your legs. And what was happening is that soldiers were being shot like this, and the bullet would break their legs. And the bones, without going into too much gory detail, the bones would then be moving against each other and do a lot of damage to the tissue and the muscles and everything else in there. And on a battlefield where you're covered in mud and mud is going into that wound, it would basically create the perfect conditions for infection. So the wound, and trying to move that soldier, because the natural reaction is he's been shot through the legs, grab him by the arms, drag him off, get him into a place of safety and look after him. But in moving him, the bones would then move against each other and do even more damage. And this very basic splint, of which there was a battlefield version, which could be pulled over the leg of an injured, wounded soldier, kept the leg static. to stop the bones from moving around and stop this damage. And to give you some idea of its effect, it reduced the mortality rate from those types of wounds from 80% to 20%. So this one little piece of kit, which is basically a couple of wires and 2 circular hoops that could be put over a leg to keep it static, reduced the mortality rate from 80% to 20%. So, you know, as much as anything else, things like this, these are the most important things that come out of this conflict. And this, you know, versions of this is a piece of kit that's still used today on modern battlefields, and indeed by modern paramedics and everything else.
Wow. Paul, we've had a couple of questions here just that I'm going to pop up on the screen. Okay. You'll probably be able to see. Can you see that? But basically, it's a quick. No, don't worry if you can't. I'll read it out. But basically, this is questions from the students at Ormiston Academy, Sheffield, and they have said. Josh has asked, did they have anaesthetic in the trenches? And Millie has asked, how much sleep would soldiers and medics get?
In terms of the first question from Josh, not in the trenches, but they did have them at the medical facilities behind the battlefield. So anaesthetists worked, and it was a very, very important part of the treatment of soldiers to get them into a condition where they were no longer awake, where they could be properly operated on and treated for their injuries. So anaesthetists did work on the battlefield, but not in the trenches, because the idea, as we'll look at in a minute, was to get the men away from that battlefield as quickly as possible into a medical facility where they could be properly treated. Now, Millie's question, which is a really good one, how much sleep would the soldiers and medics get? I think if you spoke to the average soldier and medic, they would say never enough, because it's a full-on job, both being a soldier and being a combat medic or being a medic behind the lines. And you snatched sleep as and when you could. You learned to sleep standing up. You learned to sleep marching in a column. You learned to sleep as and when you could, whenever you could, because there would be many occasions in which you'd have lots and lots of inactivity, doing nothing, and then all of a sudden something would kick off, and then you'd never rest, for X number of days beyond that. So the amount of sleep was never regulated. But one thing the army did do is it realized fairly early on, if you just keep pushing people all the time, then they'll break down, and you'll end up with sick soldiers, sick medics, and sick everybody. So they began to give them periods of rest away from the trenches, where they take them out of the battlefield area and send them to a place behind the lines in a village or a town or a camp, and then they'd have a bit of rest. But our idea of rest now and the army's idea of rest 100 years ago were two very, very different things. So they always had some sort of job to be getting on with.
I think that hopefully that'll answer Josh and Millie's questions. But if you have any more, Josh and Millie or anybody in Ormiston Academy, then you can pop them in the chat and we'll discuss them. I'll let you move on, Paul. Okay,
so we're going to look at how they actually, because we've touched on a few of these things with these excellent questions. How did they get the process by which they got men off the battlefield? And essentially this idea of what we've now called triage was developed during the war, where you'd assess men in terms of their wounds and decide whether they could be treated on the spot, so therefore patched up with a light wound, and then sent back to their rifle section or company or whatever it was, or if they required hospital treatment, so in a medical facility away from the battlefield, or if they were beyond help and could not be treated, nothing you could do could save their lives. And sadly, that was a reality. And what the army then did was to set up an evacuation system using the stretcher bearers that we spoke about, Noel Chasse and his men, and then the medics, whose photographs that we saw in the first slide, to treat these men. And the first port of call was the regimental aid post, which was on or near the battlefield. Now, this could literally just be a shell hole, which wounded were brought to, and men like Noel Chasse would be in that shell hole. A guy would come in and he'd look at him and say, yep, I can patch him up, send him back, or no, I can clean his wound, put a dressing on it, and he's got to go off to the dressing station, or no, I can't do anything for him, he's going to die, put him over there. So that's the regimental aid post. The ones that then required hospital treatment would be handed over by the stretcher bearers to men from the Royal Army Medical Corps, who would then take them to an advanced dressing station. Now, this would be further back. So this map shows Ypres, where the front line was for a big chunk of the First World War, and then Popperinga to the left, behind the lines, about 8 miles between those two places. So the red circle is the front line with the regimental aid post. The blue circle is the dressing station, and the yellow circle is the casualty clearing station, because when they got to the dressing station, there were proper medical officers there who would reassess them, work out whether they got worse or whether they'd stabilized. They'd remove the bandages that they got on the battlefield, which would be covered in mud, throw them away, clean the wound again, redress it, and then decide what they were going to do. Could they be treated there, or did they require further treatment? And then they would be sent to the casualty clearing station. So if we look at a visual idea of what that meant, so this is an image from a stereo card that was produced during the war, and it's a fake image in some respects, because those are real soldiers on there, and that's a real bit of battlefield, but this has been a reconstruction done for the camera. So the casualties that we see lying around there are men pretending to be dead and wounded, but every one of them is a real soldier. So what they're doing here, this is stretcher bearers like Noel Chasse and his men from the Liverpool Scottish, picking up the wounded and putting them on stretchers to be carried off to the regimental aid post. And the regimental aid post, good example of it. Here's one. Again, this is a reconstruction photograph, and this shows a bit of trench somewhere just off the battlefield, and these men are now bringing the wounded to the medical officer for assessment and treatment, patching them up and deciding what to do with them next. Now, they could be handed over to the medics, as I said, but in some cases, particularly when there was a lot of casualties, men were encouraged to walk, if they were classified as walking wounded, to walk to the next facility, to where the dressing station, whether that was an advanced dressing station or main dressing station, was. And this is a photograph taken during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 that shows wounded soldiers, including on the left a wounded stretcher bearer, walking from Delville Wood back to the dressing station at a place called Bernafay Wood. And we mentioned before about both sides treating each other's wounded. If you look in the middle of the photograph, there's a German. So there he is, arm in arms with British Tommies, being escorted back to the dressing station because he's wounded and requires treatment. So this shows that, you know, despite all this carnage and everything else, there was a degree of humanity going on these battlefields.
I'm just going to ask you, Paul, a couple of questions. One I'll actually put up on the screen now, which is from Leo, who says, how would you know if a photo is faked? How would you know if a photo is faked?
That's a very, very good question. And in the First World War, one of the first things that you've got to ask yourself when you see a photograph that, for example, is purported to show a battlefield and is taken on a battlefield is, given that the size of a camera was quite big, about the size, if you think of a toaster that you toast your toast with every morning, the average camera was bigger than a toaster. So you've got to carry this thing around. It's got to be on a tripod. It's not handheld. It's got to be on a tripod. How are you going to set that up in the midst of a battlefield with bullets flying everywhere and shrapnel and gas and take photographs? So when you see photographs like that, you've got to say to yourself, how could it possibly be taken? Now, there are some actual real photographs of combat, but there are many in which it just wasn't possible to do that. So they faked them, reconstructed them.
There is that famous one, isn't there, of the French soldier who's either been shot or about to be shot. I'm pretty sure that's real, isn't it? Is that a real? I'm pretty sure that's a real one.
There's one where he's recoiling backwards on the edge of a shell crater, which is a very, very famous photograph, and that actually dates from an interwar film. So that's actually from a movie, not from not from any real sort of battlefield footage. Those sort of pictures were almost impossible to take in the First World War, and even with handheld cameras like Kodak pocket cameras and things like that, without getting too technical with the cameras, they just weren't advanced enough to be able to take combat photographs in the same way, for example, that Robert Capa could do so on D-Day when he landed on Omaha Beach. And we've got those iconic, slightly out of focus, slightly distorted views of American soldiers coming off landing craft. That sort of imagery was much more problematic in the First World War. So in terms of working out whether something is faked, that's the first question you've got to ask yourself. If it shows a battlefield, how could the person taking the photograph take that photograph and live? That's the most important thing. And then you look at the battlefield and is it too clean? You know, where's the mud? Where's the barbed wire? Where's the shell holes, etc. So there's all sorts of other questions you can ask. But that's certainly the first one. But it's a good question, very good question.
Going back, Paul, just a couple of minutes. Somebody, Kirsty Harrison, has asked: X-rays or blood transfusions, which saved more lives during World War I?
Probably X-rays, because, as I say, they didn't entirely understand blood groups. So although they were doing blood transfusions, some men were given the wrong blood group, because there are different blood groups, and if you don't get the right one, then it's pointless. So X-rays, where they're able to literally pick out these tiny slivers of metal that's gone into the lungs or whatever of a soldier, and then remove that with the aid of the X-ray, seeing exactly where it is, that probably saved more lives.
Super, thank you.
So continuing our look at the chain of evacuation. So you've been wounded on the battlefield, picked up by a stretcher bearer, brought to an aid post, and then you've either been carried off by the medics or you're walking. And where you come to next is casualty clearing stations, where there are ambulances, which we can see here. So motorized ambulances. When the war began, most of the RAMC equipment was horse-drawn. That was the reality of the army at that time. But as the war went static, they built specially designed dressing stations, and this is one near Ypres with a little plan of it. And each of those rooms had a different purpose, different method of different place where you treat different types of wounds, and then stores for medical equipment and so on. And this one is near to this one, which many schools battlefield tours go to. This is Essex Farm near Ypres, where John McCrae, who was then a captain in 1915, wrote the famous In Flanders Fields poem. It was then a wooden dressing station, and then in 1916 British engineers built this, which is a concrete bunker, so that the wounded could be kept inside the rooms that we can see the entrances to there, to be properly treated, protected by the concrete from any further enemy shell fire. So the network and infrastructure of the casualty evacuation system got more complex as the war went on, but many dressing stations were like this. And this is a photograph taken by an officer of the Welsh Regiment, again near Ypres, and this shows a typical farm building that has been turned into a dressing station. So they've used, in this case, a barn, which has got a big open space inside, where they have trestle tables where they could put the stretchers on, and the men would come in, brought into here, use the barn as protection from fire and from the elements, rain or whatever, and then reassess the men here and then move them on. But the biggest threat to places like this was not the rain of shells, but it could be poison gas. And there's two things that we can see on here that gives us an indication of this. One of them is these rolled up things we can see around the doors, and they're gas blankets. So they're blankets impregnated in chemicals to stop the gas from getting in. And in case of a gas attack, they pull the strap and they drop down and they seal the dressing station up and make it gas free. And to the left, hanging on the wall there, is an upside down shell case, which is a gas gong. So if somebody smells gas or sees a gas shell go off, they hit that with a bit of metal and shout gas, 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 indicating that a gas attack is coming in. So gas was, even in dressing stations, it was a very, very problematic thing that they had to deal with. So having been treated there, so you've gone from the shell hole on the battlefield to the dressing station, whether that's a bunker or a farm building, your next port of call is a casualty clearing station. And this is one near Popperinga called Remy Siding. It's got big huts. It covers a square mile of ground. And to give you an idea of how big it was, this is a German aerial photograph from 1918 of a similar casualty clearing station on the Somme. And we can see the Red Cross laid out on the ground to indicate that it's a dressing station, not barracks. But we can see the large number of buildings there, so semi-permanent structures that were constructed so these men could be properly treated. And here, when you got to this is where your chances of surviving your wound increased dramatically, because there were proper specialist medical officers and surgeons here who could operate on you. So if you required immediate treatment to remove shell fragments or a bullet or whatever, this is where you get it. This is where the X-rays were. This is where the blood transfusion was. And this is also where nurses work. So this is the closest that women got to the battlefield in terms of medical treatment. So it was a very, very important part of...
Paul, I'm just gonna cut in there. I was listening to your podcast actually the other day about the cemetery that I think you've got on one of these slides. Actually, it might be the last slide, but you did mention that there was a female nurse buried in the cemetery. I think it was Millie something, was it?
It's Nellie Spindler. Nellie Spindler, yeah.
That's the one. Yeah. Who was? I think. Did you say she was the only woman in the cemetery of 11,000?
That's right. So she's the only woman. She's the only British Army nurse buried in there. Now, it is believed that there's a Chinese plot in there, which is another subject in its own right, where there's at least one or more Chinese women buried in that plot. But in terms of the British Army graves, she is the only woman in there. She's the only nurse, and she's one of only a handful of nurses killed in Flanders during the First World War. As the war went on, I mean, this is the next step beyond the casualty clearing station, which is a base hospital. But if we look at this next photograph, just to keep moving, this is a base hospital on the French coast at a place called Étaples near Boulogne, and you can see they haven't just had a pillow fight and ended up with all this outside. This is the result of enemy bombing. So the Germans have sent bombers over this camp, and they've bombed the camp, and some of the bombs have missed and hit the hospital. So again, this is how women get killed in the First World War, by working in hospitals like this, where they get bombed and women die. And here at Étaples, quite a few women die under these circumstances, and indeed on other places on different parts of the Western Front. So that's
how far behind the lines typically was the kind of base hospital?
That's a good question. So if we start from where we began, which is on the battlefield, the shell hole's on the battlefield. The dressing station is a mile or so from the actual fighting. The casualty clearing station is 6 to 10 miles from the battlefield, and the hospital could be 50 miles from the battlefield. So quite some way and a degree of safety.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Sarah says, sorry, Paul and Tom, we have to go now, but thanks so much. Cheers, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry if I've rattled on too long. So we've got just to look at other aspects and other soldiers as well. We've talked a lot about the Royal Army Medical Corps and stretcher bearers. There were men of many nations serving on the Western Front by 1918, and these are Indian transport from an Indian transport unit that was used quite typically by the Indian medical services to evacuate their wounded. So although the Indian Army was part of the British Expeditionary Force, it had its own separate medical service to treat the wounded. And this is an example of some of those Indian wounded soldiers being brought back to the UK, and they were treated at Brighton at the Pavilion there in 1914 and 1915. But we mentioned nurses, and I wanted to make just a brief comment about them. There were two key types of nurses in the First World War. The one we see sitting in the middle, who's a QA, a member of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service, and then the other ladies are what's called VADs, who were part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment. So the one in the middle, she's a professional nurse. She's a trained nurse, trained in civilian life before the war. The others are volunteers to do general medical duties. But their role was very, very important. And this brought women onto the battlefield, not right into the shell holes, but to the casualty clearing stations close to the front line. And we tend not to think, as in the First World War, of women as veterans, which is why I wanted to show you this photograph, which shows a group of American Red Cross nurses in the 1920s visiting the battlefields at Verdun. And these are veterans. These are just a group of women on a jolly, on a holiday, in the Champagne district or somewhere nice in France where they can get a decent meal. These are women who've served for years on the battlefield, treating wounded, and they've come back to see the places where they served in exactly the same way that the men who served as soldiers in the many battalions of all armies came back and did exactly the same thing. So that's part of the women's experience, really, of the Great War. And the net currency of all of this sort of work, of course, was men, was the wounded. And these are 3 photographs that I've got of wounded soldiers, all of whom that have lost limbs. And the number of limbless ex-servicemen in the war was just staggering. There was 2.2 million soldiers were wounded in the war, in the British Army alone, 2.2 million. And in the infantry, your chances of being killed was about 1 in 5. And 1 in 5 of the infantry were killed, rather, and 3 in 5 of the infantry were wounded. So that meant that your chances of getting absolutely nothing was pretty slim. It's, you know, these men, in many respects, are the forgotten survivors of the First World War. And that leads me on to this photograph, which, you know, these are ex-soldiers. So these are veterans, just like.
By the way, don't worry. By the way, Paul, don't worry about time. By the way, don't worry about it. If you know, just relax. Just take whatever time you want to finish. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're almost there. We're almost there.
Yeah.
So these guys are veterans, and if you look, they're both wearing the same badge on their jacket lapel, and this is a tiny silver badge that's unique to them. It's got a number on the back that's unique to that soldier, and it's called a Silver War Badge. And they were issued to men who were discharged due to their wounds or sickness received on active service. And this was basically a badge of honor. This showed that you'd been in the thick of the fighting, that you'd been wounded and discharged, or you'd received a disability or illness that was directly related to your years of service on the Western Front, or Gallipoli, or Mesopotamia, or Salonika, or, you know, or wherever it was. And again, these are, you know, you're looking at the faces, as I say, of the forgotten survivors of the First World War, not the glorious dead, the men who came home and had to live not just with the implications of physical wounds, but the implications of the mental scars that they had through the service that they got. And, you know, what goes hand in hand with any type of injury, even now, with any type of injury, is damage to people's mental health. And these men were damaged for the rest of their life by their experiences in the trenches, because but they showed it in all sorts of different ways. But this little badge was almost part of like a symbol of a secret club that existed in the 1920s and 30s. And if you saw a guy with one of these, then you knew that he'd been in the thick of it. Now, they all got medals, but you could get 2 medals for spending 2 years in the trenches, and you could get the same 2 medals for baking bread 100 miles behind the lines at Rouen. So that if looking at medals didn't tell you anything, it didn't say whether you'd seen combat or not. But if you had one of these, this is a man that had been in the thick of it. So it was an important thing. And just ending with that thought of the old veteran I mentioned with wooden crosses, this is what you were referring to earlier, Tom. This is Lissenherk Cemetery. So this was nearly 11,000 graves right next door to a casualty clearing station. Every one of those crosses that we see on there represents a life, but it represents a soldier who had died of his wounds, because our medical services, the British and Commonwealth medical services, were probably amongst the best, but still men died because there was no antibiotics, and that was another key to understanding all this. Without the ability to treat infection with antibiotics, thousands, tens of thousands, probably several 100,000 men died as a consequence of this. So it's with that thought, as good as it was, still some never made it home. And if we jump on to the Second World War just briefly, the casualties amongst the infantry in Normandy in 1944 were as high as most battlefields of the First World War. But cemeteries like this do not exist in Normandy. And that's because a generation later, they did have antibiotics, and men could be treated very quickly for the infections that wounds caused. And it meant that their survivability and their chances of survival was much, much higher. So that's where we end. Et voila.
Paul, absolutely fantastic, absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. We've had lots of comments from, as I said, we've had schools in Abu Dhabi watching today. We've had schools in Unity Academy, Blackpool, Sheffield, Yeah, and probably lots of others will be watching back to use this for medicine through time. So it's just to say from myself and from St. Edmunds Arrowsmith in Knowsley and the kids who've been involved here in this as well, thank you so much for giving up your time.
My pleasure, as always.
Because I know you're a busy man. And, I recommend to any student who's watching this to check out Paul's podcast. You put that on the last slide there, didn't you, Paul? You've removed it now.
I
But
did.
the Old Front Line.
Yep.
I am an avid listener and supporter. It's a brilliant podcast, very accessible to students and teachers and anybody who is interested in the history of the Western Front. Top man, Paul, thanks very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And I'll speak to you soon. Oh, there we go. A comment from Kirsty. Thank you. So informative. So we've had quite a lot of comments. Carol says, thank you so much, gentlemen, from Unity Academy. And also Adele says, thanks so much. Very interesting from 10A1 in Ormiston, Sheffield. So thanks a lot, Paul. And I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.